The grand halls of Ashford Manor had known many governesses, but none had ever dared to dream they might become its duchess. Yet on a frost-laden morning in December 1887, when Miss Josephine Hartley arrived at the imposing estate, with nothing but a worn carpet-bag and a letter of reference, she could not have imagined that two small voices would soon plead for the impossible, that she, a woman of no fortune or family, might become their mother. The Duke of Ashford had sworn never to remarry after tragedy claimed his beloved wife. But children, in their innocent wisdom, see what adults refuse to acknowledge. And sometimes, the heart they mend is not only their own. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're listening to this story. I want to know how far it has traveled. The December wind carried the scent of coal smoke and pine as the hired carriage rattled through the iron gates of Ashford Manor. Josephine Hartley pressed her gloved hand against the frosted window, her breath forming delicate clouds against the glass as she glimpsed her new home for the first time. The estate rose before her like something from a Gothic novel, all grey stone and towering chimneys, its windows glowing amber in the late afternoon light. She was 23 years old, possessed of dark auburn hair that refused to stay properly pinned, and grey eyes that her late mother had once called too observant for a woman's own good. Her dress was respectable but plain, the black wool showing signs of careful mending at the cuffs. Everything she owned fit into the single carpet-bag at her feet. "Ashford Manor, miss," the driver announced, his Yorkshire accent thick as treacle. "They say the Duke hasn't been the same since the Duchess passed. 3 years now and still wears mourning." Josephine said nothing, though her heart quickened. The advertisement had been sparse. Governess required for 2 children, ages 6 and 8. Must be educated, patient, and discreet. References essential. She had written from the boarding house in London, where she'd been staying since her father's death 6 months prior, spending her last shillings on postage and prayer. The housekeeper who met her at the servants' entrance was a formidable woman named Mrs. Blackwood, her silver hair pulled back so severely it seemed to lift her eyebrows. "You'll address His Grace as Your Grace, and keep to the nursery wing. The children take their meals separately, and you're not to disturb His Grace unless absolutely necessary. He's a very private man." "I understand," Josephine replied, following the woman through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. The nursery wing occupied the eastern corner of the 3rd floor, a suite of rooms that had clearly once been filled with laughter, but now felt hushed, almost mournful. 2 small faces peered at her from behind a rocking horse when she entered, a girl with golden ringlets and a boy whose serious dark eyes reminded Josephine of storm clouds. "I'm Miss Hartley," she said gently, kneeling to their level. "But you may call me Miss Josephine if you prefer." "I'm Lady Charlotte," the girl announced with the confidence of her 8 years, "and this is Lord Edmund. He doesn't talk much anymore." The boy said nothing, merely studied Josephine with an intensity that seemed far too old for his 6 years. Over the following weeks, Josephine discovered the shape of her golden cage. The nursery was comfortable, even luxurious, with its own small library and a schoolroom filled with maps and globes. The children were provided with everything material comfort could offer: fine clothes, expensive toys, the best tutors money could hire. Yet they were profoundly, achingly lonely. Their father, Frederick Ashford, the Duke of Ashford, was a ghost in his own home. Josephine caught glimpses of him, a tall figure in black moving through distant corridors, a silhouette in the library window, a man who took his meals alone and rode out each morning before dawn, as if trying to outrun his own shadow. "Papa used to read to us every night," Charlotte confided one evening as Josephine tucked her into bed. "Before Mama died, now he can't even look at us without his eyes going all sad." "Perhaps," Josephine said carefully, "he sees your mother in your faces and it hurts him to remember." "But we need him to remember," Charlotte whispered. "We're forgetting what she sounded like." Edmund, who had been silent in his own bed, turned his face to the wall. Josephine's days fell into a careful rhythm. Mornings were devoted to lessons, history, literature, mathematics, French. She discovered that Charlotte had a gift for languages, and Edmund possessed an almost frightening aptitude for numbers. Afternoons were spent in the gardens when weather permitted, or in the music room, where Josephine taught them the pianoforte pieces her own mother had once taught her. She was careful never to overstep her position. She took her meals in the nursery, not the servants' hall or the family dining room. She kept her opinions to herself when the other servants gossiped. She was in every way the perfect governess, invisible, efficient, unremarkable, except to the children. "You smell like lavender," Charlotte said one day, pressing close as they read together. "Mama used to smell like roses, but I like lavender better. It's not so sad." Edmund began speaking again, first in single words, then sentences, then entire conversations that tumbled out as if a dam had broken. He told her about the treehouse his father had built, now abandoned, about his mother's laugh, which had sounded like bells, about the nightmares that still woke him, where he couldn't remember her face. "You won't leave us, will you, Miss Josephine?" he asked one night after a particularly vivid nightmare had sent him seeking comfort. "Not if I can help it," she promised, smoothing his dark hair back from his forehead. But even as she spoke, she felt the precariousness of her position. She was a servant, however genteel. Her presence here depended entirely on the Duke's continued approval, and she had yet to exchange more than a dozen words with the man. That changed on a bitter January morning when Edmund fell ill with a fever. The boy burned like a coal, his small body racked with chills, despite the fire blazing in the nursery grate. Charlotte hovered nearby, her face pale with fear, while Josephine bathed Edmund's forehead with cool cloths and murmured reassurances she didn't quite feel. "Fetch the doctor," she told one of the maids, "immediately." But it was the Duke who appeared first, summoned by Charlotte's desperate flight through the manor. He filled the doorway of the nursery, and for the first time Josephine saw him clearly. A man perhaps 35, with dark hair silvered at the temples and eyes the same stormy grey as his son's. His face was all sharp angles and aristocratic planes, handsome in the way of marble statues and just as cold. "What's happened?" His voice was deep, commanding, edged with something that might have been panic. "A fever, Your Grace," Josephine said, rising but not leaving Edmund's side. "I've sent for Dr. Morrison." Frederick crossed to the bed in 3 strides, his hand trembling slightly as he touched his son's burning cheek. "How long has he been like this?" "Since this morning. It came on suddenly." "This is how it started with Eleanor," he said, so quietly Josephine almost didn't hear. "The fever, then—" "This is not the same," Josephine said firmly, surprising herself with her boldness. "Edmund is strong, and Dr. Morrison is excellent. Your son will recover, Your Grace." Their eyes met over the child's bed, and something passed between them, a shared fear, a desperate hope. Then the Duke's expression shuttered closed once more. "See that he does," he said, and left as abruptly as he'd arrived. But that night, as Josephine dozed in the chair beside Edmund's bed, she woke to find the Duke sitting on the opposite side, his son's small hand clasped in his larger one, his lips moving in what might have been prayer. He didn't acknowledge her presence, and she pretended to sleep, but something had shifted in the careful architecture of Ashford Manor. The Duke had stepped out of his self-imposed exile, if only for a moment, and Josephine Hartley, who had learned long ago not to hope for more than her station allowed, felt the first dangerous flutter of something she couldn't quite name stirring in her carefully guarded heart. Edmund's fever broke on the 3rd day, leaving the boy weak but smiling, and leaving Josephine exhausted but profoundly relieved. The Duke had maintained his vigil each night, arriving after the children slept and departing before dawn, a silent sentinel who never spoke but whose presence filled the room like a held breath. On the morning Edmund was declared fully recovered, Dr. Morrison patted Josephine's hand with grandfatherly approval. "Your devoted care saved him, Miss Hartley. The Duke should be grateful to have someone so capable attending his children." But gratitude, Josephine soon learned, was not what the Duke felt. She was summoned to his study on a grey February afternoon, the first time she had been called to any room in the manor outside the nursery wing. The study was all dark wood and leather, smelling of tobacco and old books, and the Duke stood with his back to her, staring out at the frost-covered gardens. "Miss Hartley," he began without turning, "I must speak with you about a delicate matter." "Of course, Your Grace." Her hands were clasped tightly before her, her spine straight despite the anxiety coiling in her stomach. "My children have become attached to you." He said it as if it were an accusation, excessively so. "I hope I have given no cause for concern in my duties." "Your duties." He turned then, and his face was a mask of aristocratic displeasure. "Your duty is to educate them, Miss Hartley, not to replace their mother." And the words struck like a physical blow. "I would never presume. Charlotte calls you our Josephine now. Edmund asks for you before he asks for me. You have overstepped, Miss Hartley, however unintentionally." His voice was cold, controlled, but beneath it she heard something else. Fear, perhaps, or pain. "I am hosting a gathering this weekend. Several families of consequence will be attending, including the Ashworths. Lord Ashworth has a daughter, Miss Cordelia Ashworth, who has been recommended as a potential governess of more appropriate bearing." Josephine felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. "You're dismissing me." "I am considering alternatives. Miss Ashworth will be observing your methods during the gathering. If she proves suitable, we will discuss your departure. The children will adjust. They are young, they are resilient." But his jaw was tight, his hands clenched behind his back. "You will attend the gathering as well. The children will be presented to the guests, and you will demonstrate your teaching methods. Consider it an opportunity to prove your worth, though I suspect Miss Ashworth's superior breeding will speak for itself." Superior breeding. The words hung in the air like poison. Josephine was the daughter of a country vicar, educated but poor, genteel but powerless. Miss Cordelia Ashworth would be everything she was not: connected, wealthy, appropriate. "As you wish, Your Grace," she managed, her voice steady, despite the trembling in her limbs. The weekend arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if nature itself mocked the ice in Josephine's veins. The manor filled with guests, lords and ladies in their finest, their carriages clogging the drive, their laughter echoing through halls that had been silent for so long. Josephine dressed the children with extra care. Charlotte in white muslin with blue ribbons, Edmund in a small suit that made him look heartbreakingly grown. "Why are there so many people?" Charlotte asked, her usual confidence wavering. "Your father is rejoining society," Josephine explained, fastening the last button. "It's a good thing. He's been alone too long. But you'll stay with us." Edmund's dark eyes were wide with worry. "Always," she promised, though the lie tasted bitter on her tongue. The presentation took place in the grand drawing-room, where 30 guests had assembled for afternoon tea. Josephine stood to the side as the Duke introduced his children, his hand resting briefly on each small head with a tenderness that made her chest ache. Then she saw her Miss Cordelia Ashworth. The woman was perhaps 25, beautiful in the way of porcelain dolls, with golden hair arranged in elaborate curls and a dress of emerald silk that probably cost more than Josephine earned in a year. She stood beside an older woman who could only be her mother, Lady Ashworth, whose sharp eyes assessed everything with the precision of a jeweller examining stones. "And this," the Duke said, his voice carrying across the room, "is Miss Hartley, the children's current governess. Miss Hartley, perhaps you would demonstrate your teaching methods for our guests?" It was a test, and everyone knew it. Josephine felt 30 pairs of eyes upon her as she moved to where the children stood. Her hands were steady as she opened the book she'd brought, a volume of Wordsworth's poetry. "Lady Charlotte has been studying romantic poetry," she said clearly. "Charlotte, would you recite 'I wandered lonely as a cloud' for our guests?" Charlotte's voice was small at first, then grew stronger, her childish pronunciation lending the familiar words a fresh sweetness. When she finished, there was genuine applause, and the girl's face lit with pride. "And Lord Edmund has been studying mathematics," Josephine continued. "Edmund, can you tell our guests what you've learned about prime numbers?" The boy launched into an explanation that was remarkably sophisticated for his age, his earlier shyness forgotten in his enthusiasm for the subject. More applause followed, warmer this time. Josephine allowed herself a moment of hope. Perhaps the Duke would see that his children were thriving, that her methods were sound, that— How charming! Lady Ashworth's voice cut through the applause like a knife through silk. "Though I must say, Miss Hartley, your approach seems rather informal. Poetry and mathematics are well enough, but what of deportment, French conversation, the social graces that will serve these children in their proper stations? I assure you, Lady Ashworth, we study French daily, and— Do you speak French, Miss Hartley?" Miss Cordelia Ashworth asked, her voice sweet as honey laced with arsenic. "Truly speak it, I mean, not merely read from a primer. I am proficient in— Parlez-vous couramment?" Miss Ashworth continued in flawless Parisian French. "Pouvez-vous enseigner les nuances de la haute société française?" Josephine's French was adequate for teaching children, but she could not match the fluency of someone who had clearly spent seasons in Paris. Her hesitation was answer enough. "I thought not," Lady Ashworth said with false sympathy. "You see, Your Grace, this is precisely what we discussed. Miss Hartley is doubtless a good woman, but the children require someone who can prepare them for their future positions in society, someone who understands their world because she inhabits it herself. Miss Ashworth has studied at the finest institutions in Switzerland and France," the Duke said, and Josephine heard the decision already made in his voice. "She comes with the highest recommendations. I'm sure the children have grown fond of you, Miss Hartley," Miss Ashworth said, moving to stand beside the Duke with proprietary ease. "But fondness is not the same as proper education. Children of this station require guidance from someone who understands the weight of their heritage." Charlotte's hand found Josephine's, gripping tightly. "But Miss Josephine does understand," the girl said, her voice trembling. "She understands us." "Hush, Charlotte," the Duke said, not unkindly. "This is not a matter for children to decide." "But, Papa—" "That's quite enough." His voice was firm now, brooking no argument. "Miss Hartley, you will remain through the end of the month to ensure a smooth transition. Miss Ashworth will begin her observations tomorrow." The room had gone silent, every guest watching the scene with the avid interest of spectators at a public execution. Josephine felt her face burn with humiliation, but she kept her chin high, her voice steady. "As you wish, Your Grace." She curtsied, the gesture mechanical, and turned to leave, but Charlotte broke away from her father, running to throw her arms around Josephine's waist. "No, you can't send her away. We need her." "Charlotte, control yourself," Lady Ashworth said sharply. "This display is most unseemly." Edmund joined his sister, his small face fierce with determination. "Miss Josephine makes Papa smile again. We've seen it. Why would you send away someone who makes us happy?" The Duke's face had gone pale, then flushed with what might have been anger or shame. "Children, enough. Go with Miss Hartley now." But the damage was done. As Josephine led the sobbing children from the room, she heard the whispers beginning, pitying, scandalized, gleeful. The poor governess, too attached. The children, too undisciplined. The Duke, finally taking control of his household. She had been publicly dismissed, publicly humiliated, and there was nothing she could do but hold her head high and pretend her heart wasn't shattering with every step. That night, after the children finally cried themselves to sleep, Josephine sat alone in the nursery and allowed herself one moment of weakness. She pressed her face into her hands and wept silently, mourning not just her position, but the impossible dream she had barely allowed herself to acknowledge, that she might have belonged here, might have been more than just a servant, might have been loved. The golden cage had never been hers at all. She had only been borrowing it, and now the true owner had come to claim what was rightfully hers. The letter arrived on a morning when frost still clung to the windows like crystallized tears. Josephine recognized the handwriting immediately. Her Aunt Marguerite, her mother's elder sister, who had made her life in London society through wit, independence, and a fortunate marriage to a wealthy merchant now 15 years deceased. My dearest Josephine, the letter began, I have heard through certain channels of your recent difficulties at Ashford Manor. Come to me at once. London has need of intelligent women, and I have need of your company. Your position there is untenable, and pride is a cold companion. I expect you by week's end. Josephine held the letter against her chest, torn between relief and despair. Leaving meant abandoning Charlotte and Edmund to Miss Ashworth's cold perfection. Staying meant enduring daily humiliation as she watched another woman take her place. The decision was made for her 2 days later. She had been supervising the children's breakfast when Miss Ashworth swept into the nursery unannounced, her mother trailing behind like a ship of war. Miss Hartley, I'll be taking the children for their morning lessons today. You may use the time to begin packing your belongings. But it's not yet the end of the month, Josephine protested. The Duke has agreed that an earlier transition would be preferable. Less emotional entanglement. Miss Ashworth's smile was sharp as cut glass. Surely you can see that your continued presence only confuses the children about their proper attachments. Charlotte's face crumpled. I don't want lessons with you. You're mean and you smell like old flowers. Charlotte. Lady Ashworth's voice cracked like a whip. You will apologize this instant for such rudeness. I won't. Miss Josephine is our governess, not her. What followed was a scene of such chaos that it would be whispered about in the servants' hall for months. Charlotte refused to apologize. Edmund locked himself in the schoolroom, and Miss Ashworth declared both children utterly undisciplined and in desperate need of firm guidance. The Duke, summoned by the commotion, stood in the nursery doorway looking haggard. His eyes met Josephine's across the room, and for a moment she saw something flicker there, regret, perhaps, or recognition of his mistake. But then Miss Ashworth touched his arm, speaking in low, urgent tones about necessary discipline and proper boundaries, and his expression hardened once more. Miss Hartley, perhaps it would be best if you left today, he said quietly. I'll provide an additional month's wages and an excellent reference. Your Grace, please. The word was barely audible. Don't make this harder than it already is. By noon, Josephine's belongings were packed. The children were confined to their rooms, forbidden to say goodbye. She left Ashford Manor as she had arrived, with a single carpet bag and a heart full of uncertainty. But this time, tears streamed freely down her face as the hired carriage carried her away. London embraced her like a living thing, loud, dirty, vibrant, and utterly overwhelming after the quiet grandeur of Ashford Manor. Aunt Marguerite's townhouse in Bloomsbury was elegant but unpretentious, filled with books and curiosities from her late husband's travels. The woman herself was 60, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, and possessed of the kind of confidence that came from having survived society's judgments and emerged triumphant. She took one look at Josephine's tear-stained face and pulled her into a fierce embrace. There now, child, let it out. Then we'll discuss what comes next. Over tea, Josephine told her everything. The children's sweetness, the Duke's grief, Miss Ashworth's calculated cruelty, and her own foolish heart that had dared to hope for more than her station allowed. You fell in love with him, Aunt Marguerite said. It wasn't a question. I fell in love with all of them, Josephine whispered. The children, the manor, the life I might have had. I was a fool. You were human. Her aunt's voice was gentle but firm. But now you must decide who you wish to be, the heartbroken governess who lets society define her worth, or a woman who recognizes that intelligence and compassion are worth more than any title. What choice do I have? I need employment, and after this, you need perspective. Aunt Marguerite set down her teacup with decisive clink. Tomorrow evening I'm hosting a salon. Writers, reformers, educators, people who believe that merit matters more than birth. You will attend, you will engage, and you will remember that you are more than what that Duke and his shallow Miss Ashworth made you feel. The salon was unlike anything Josephine had experienced. Aunt Marguerite's drawing room filled with 24 guests, men and women both, who debated everything from women's education to prison reform with passionate intensity. Josephine found herself drawn into a conversation about progressive teaching methods with a woman named Mrs. Adelaide Chen, who ran an experimental school in Kensington. We believe children learn best through engagement, not rote memorization, Mrs. Chen explained, her dark eyes bright with enthusiasm. Your methods with the Ashford children sound remarkably similar to our philosophy. I simply tried to make learning joyful, Josephine said, to see each child as an individual rather than a vessel to be filled with facts. Precisely. We're always seeking teachers with such insight. Would you consider— Adelaide is trying to recruit you, a male voice interrupted with amusement. She does this at every gathering. Josephine turned to find a man of perhaps 35, tall and lean, with intelligent hazel eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. His clothing was well made, but not ostentatious, and his smile held genuine warmth. Dr. Felix Whitmore, he introduced himself, physician and occasional meddler in educational reform. Your aunt speaks very highly of you, Miss Hartley. My aunt is biased, Josephine replied, but she found herself smiling despite her melancholy. Perhaps, or perhaps she simply recognizes quality when she sees it. He gestured to the animated conversations around them. This must seem quite different from life in a ducal manor. It's refreshing. At Ashford, I was always aware of my place, my limitations. Here, people seem to value ideas over titles. Not all of London is so enlightened, I'm afraid, but in circles like these, you'll find that merit and character matter more than bloodlines. His expression grew more serious. Your aunt mentioned you experienced some difficulty with your recent position. I hope you won't let one aristocrat's poor judgment diminish your sense of worth. There was something in his directness that made Josephine's defenses crumble slightly. It's not just his judgment. Miss Ashworth was right about some things. I'm not sophisticated enough for children of that station. I don't speak perfect French or know the intricacies of high society. But you made grieving children laugh again. You helped a traumatized boy find his voice. You taught them to love learning. Dr. Whitmore's voice was firm. Those accomplishments are worth more than any number of seasons in Paris. Their conversation was interrupted by Aunt Marguerite calling for attention. A young poet was about to read from her latest work, and the room settled into attentive silence. But Josephine found her thoughts drifting, comparing this warm, intellectual gathering to the cold formality of the Duke's drawing room. In the following weeks, Aunt Marguerite kept Josephine busy with a whirlwind of activities. They attended lectures at the Royal Institution, visited museums, and took tea with women who ran businesses and wrote books and advocated for social reform. Slowly, Josephine felt herself awakening from the fog of heartbreak. Dr. Whitmore became a frequent presence at these outings. He had a gift for drawing Josephine into conversation, for making her laugh, for reminding her that she possessed a sharp mind and worthy opinions. Unlike the Duke, who had barely spoken to her, except to dismiss her, Felix, as he insisted she call him, seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts on everything from literature to social policy. "You're wasted as a governess," he told her one afternoon as they walked through Regent's Park. "You should be teaching at a proper school or writing educational texts, or accepting that I'm fortunate to have any respectable employment at all," Josephine said wryly, "or accepting that the world is changing and women like you are leading that change." He stopped walking, turning to face her. "I've been offered a position establishing a medical clinic in Manchester, a place that will serve working families regardless of their ability to pay. The project includes an educational component, a school for the workers' children. We need someone to develop the curriculum, someone who understands that education should liberate, not merely indoctrinate. Josephine's heart quickened. You're offering me a position? I'm offering you an opportunity to build something meaningful, to use your gifts fully, to be valued for your mind rather than tolerated for your service. His eyes held hers. And perhaps, if I'm being entirely honest, I'm hoping that working together might allow me to know you better. You've impressed me greatly, Josephine. Not just your intelligence, but your compassion, your resilience, your refusal to be diminished by those who should have cherished you. It was the most direct declaration she'd ever received, and it left her breathless, not with the desperate, impossible longing she'd felt at Ashford Manor, but with something steadier, possibility, respect, the promise of partnership rather than hierarchy. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Say you'll consider it. Say you'll stop defining yourself by one man's failure to see your worth. Felix's smile was gentle. Say you'll give yourself permission to imagine a different future. That night, lying in the comfortable bed in Aunt Marguerite's guest room, Josephine allowed herself to truly consider it. Manchester, a new school, work that mattered, and Felix, kind, intelligent Felix, who saw her as an equal rather than a subordinate. It should have been an easy choice. Yet her treacherous heart kept returning to two small faces, to a grey-eyed boy who had finally learned to smile again, to a golden-haired girl who had called her our Josephine. She wondered if they missed her. She wondered if Miss Ashworth had proven as capable as her credentials suggested. She wondered if the Duke ever thought of her at all, or if she had been as easily replaced as a piece of furniture. The answer, she told herself firmly, didn't matter. Ashford Manor was her past. Manchester, and whatever future she chose to build there, was waiting. She just had to find the courage to reach for it. Spring arrived in London with unexpected warmth, coaxing blossoms from the trees in Hyde Park and drawing society from their winter hibernation. Josephine had been in the city for 2 months, and the transformation in her was remarkable. Under Aunt Marguerite's guidance, she had acquired a new wardrobe. Nothing extravagant, but well-tailored dresses in soft colours that brought out the auburn in her hair and the clarity of her grey eyes. More importantly, she had acquired confidence. The salons, the lectures, the conversations with people who valued her mind, all of it had reminded her that she was more than a dismissed governess. She was a woman of intelligence and capability, worthy of respect. Felix had been patient, never pressing for an answer to his Manchester proposal, but his attentions had grown more marked. He brought her books he thought she'd enjoy, invited her to medical lectures, and spoke of the future with an enthusiasm that was both flattering and slightly overwhelming. "You're glowing," Aunt Marguerite observed one morning over breakfast. "Felix Whitmore is good for you." "He's kind," Josephine agreed carefully, "and the work in Manchester sounds meaningful." "But," her aunt's eyebrow arched knowingly, "but nothing. I'm seriously considering his offer." "You're still thinking about those children, and their impossible father." Josephine set down her teacup with more force than necessary. "I'm not. That chapter is closed." "Then you won't mind attending Lady Pemberton's charity gala next week. It's for children's literacy, quite aligned with your interests, and Felix has already agreed to escort you." Lady Pemberton's gala was one of the season's most prestigious events, held in a magnificent ballroom in Mayfair. Josephine had never attended anything so grand, and as she descended from the carriage on Felix's arm, wearing a gown of deep blue silk that Aunt Marguerite had insisted on purchasing, she felt like an impostor playing at being a lady. "You look beautiful," Felix murmured, and the sincerity in his voice steadied her nerves. The ballroom was a sea of jewels and silk, of titles and old money. Josephine recognized several faces from the newspapers, politicians, philanthropists, members of the aristocracy who dabbled in charitable works. She and Felix made their way through the crowd, stopping to speak with Mrs. Chen and other acquaintances from the reform circles. Then she heard a voice that turned her blood to ice. "Miss Hartley." Can it truly be you? She turned to find Miss Cordelia Ashworth bearing down on her, resplendent in pink satin with Lady Ashworth at her side. And behind them, looking as if he'd rather be anywhere else, was the Duke of Ashford. Josephine's heart stopped, then raced. He looked thinner than she remembered, shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there before. His evening clothes were impeccable, but there was something diminished about him, as if grief had carved away everything but the essential man. Their eyes met across the space of a few feet, and the world seemed to narrow to just that connection. She saw shock in his expression, then something that might have been pain or longing or regret. "Miss Hartley," Miss Ashworth repeated, her voice carrying that familiar edge of false sweetness. "How unexpected to see you here. I wasn't aware that governesses attended such events." "Miss Hartley is my guest," Felix said smoothly, his hand tightening protectively on Josephine's arm. "She's been consulting on an educational project I'm developing in Manchester." "How industrious," Lady Ashworth said, the word dripping with condescension. "Though I suppose one must find employment where one can." "Indeed," Josephine replied, finding her voice and her courage. "Meaningful work is a privilege I don't take for granted. How are the children, Miss Ashworth? I trust they're progressing well under your instruction?" Something flickered in Miss Ashworth's eyes. Annoyance, perhaps, or guilt. "The children are adjusting. They can be quite stubborn when they choose to be." "They're miserable," the Duke said suddenly, his voice rough. Everyone turned to stare at him. "They refuse to engage with their lessons. Edmund has stopped speaking again. Charlotte cries herself to sleep every night. They ask for you constantly, Miss Hartley." "Frederick," Lady Ashworth hissed, "this is hardly the place." "They ask for her," he repeated, his eyes never leaving Josephine's face. "And I was too proud, too foolish, too afraid to admit that I made a terrible mistake in letting you go." The confession hung in the air like a thunderclap. Around them, conversations faltered as people turned to witness the scene. Miss Ashworth's face had gone white, then red. "Your Grace, you cannot be serious. After all the work I've done, the improvements I've implemented, you've implemented discipline without love, structure without joy. You've tried to mold my children into perfect little aristocrats, and in the process you've broken their spirits." The Duke's voice was steady now, gaining strength. "Miss Hartley gave them something I couldn't: hope, laughter, the belief that they were worthy of affection despite their grief, and I repaid her by humiliating her in front of half the county." "This is absurd," Lady Ashworth sputtered. "The woman is a nobody, a vicar's daughter with no connections or fortune. She's entirely unsuitable." "She's extraordinary," the Duke interrupted, "and I've been a blind fool not to see it sooner." Josephine felt Felix's hand slip from her arm. When she glanced at him, she saw understanding in his eyes, and something like resignation. "It seems," he said quietly, "that your heart has already made its choice." "Felix, it's all right." His smile was sad but genuine. "I hoped I might be enough to help you forget him, but some connections can't be reasoned away." He bowed slightly. "If you'll excuse me, I believe I see Mrs. Chen. She'll be disappointed to lose you to Derbyshire." He walked away, leaving Josephine facing the Duke and the furious Ashworth women. The ballroom had gone almost silent, everyone straining to hear what would happen next. "You cannot possibly be suggesting that this governess should return to Ashford Manor," Lady Ashworth said, her voice shaking with rage. "The scandal alone would be nothing compared to the scandal of my children's continued unhappiness," the Duke said firmly. He took a step toward Josephine, his expression raw with emotion. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you. I dismissed you cruelly, publicly, because I was terrified of what you represented. You made my children happy. You made me remember what it felt like to hope, and that frightened me more than anything had since Eleanor's death." "Your Grace," Josephine whispered, acutely aware of the dozens of eyes upon them, "this is not the place. I've spent 2 months watching my children fade, watching Miss Ashworth try to force them into molds they don't fit, watching the light go out of their eyes again." He was close enough now that she could see the desperation in his face. "Come back, Josephine, not as a governess, as something more, as the woman who saved my family when I was too broken to save it myself." "Are you asking me to be their governess again?" Her voice trembled. "I'm asking you to be their mother." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled crowd. "I'm asking you to marry me, if you can possibly forgive me for being such a colossal fool. I'm asking you to take a chance on a damaged man and two heartbroken children who need you more than they need their next breath." The ballroom erupted in whispers. Miss Ashworth made a sound like a wounded animal. Lady Ashworth looked as if she might faint from sheer outrage, but Josephine heard none of it. She was staring at the Duke, at Frederick, seeing past the title and the wealth to the man beneath. The grieving widower who had finally found the courage to live again, the father who loved his children enough to risk society's censure, the man who was offering her not just a position, but a place, a home, a family. "The children," she said slowly. "Do they know you're here? Do they know what you're asking? They made me promise to bring you home." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Edmund said if I didn't fix this, he'd never forgive me. Charlotte said you were the best thing that ever happened to us, and only a complete nodcock, her words, would let you go." Despite everything, Josephine laughed. It bubbled up from somewhere deep inside, breaking through the shock and the fear and the impossible hope. "She called you a nodcock, among other things. My children, it seems, have very strong opinions about my romantic incompetence." He held out his hand, palm up, an offering and a plea. "Come home, Josephine. Let me spend the rest of my life proving that you belong with us, that you always did." She looked at his outstretched hand, then at his face, no longer cold and distant, but open, vulnerable, terrifyingly sincere. She thought of Charlotte's golden curls and Edmund's serious eyes. She thought of the nursery that had felt more like home than anywhere she'd ever lived. She thought of the man before her who had finally found the courage to choose love over fear. "Yes," she whispered. Then, louder, "Yes." He closed the distance between them in a heartbeat, taking her hands in his, and the ballroom erupted in a chaos of reactions, applause from some quarters, scandalized gasps from others, and from the Ashworth women, sounds of pure fury. But Josephine heard only Frederick's voice as he leaned close and murmured, thank you for giving us another chance." And for the first time since leaving Ashford Manor, she felt the broken pieces of her heart begin to mend. The journey back to Ashford Manor felt like travelling through a dream. Josephine sat in the Duke's carriage. Frederick's carriage, she reminded herself, trying to grow accustomed to thinking of him by his given name, watching the countryside roll past in the grey light of early morning. They had left London before dawn, both too anxious to wait another moment. "They don't know I'm coming," she said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Frederick's hand found hers, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "I wanted to be certain you'd say yes before I raised their hopes. They've been disappointed enough." His voice roughened. "We all have. What happened after I left?" "Truly?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape. Edmund stopped eating properly. Charlotte became defiant in ways I'd never seen, refusing lessons, locking herself in her room. Miss Ashworth tried everything, discipline, rewards, appeals to duty. Nothing worked. He turned to look at her, and the pain in his eyes was stark. "One night I found Edmund in the nursery, holding one of your handkerchiefs. He looked at me and said, 'You sent away the only person who made us feel safe.' And I realized what I'd done. Not just to them, but to you, to all of us. Miss Ashworth must have been furious when you dismissed her. She threatened legal action, claimed breach of contract, said she'd ruin my reputation." A bitter smile touched his lips. "Lady Ashworth was worse. She spent an hour cataloguing all the ways you were unsuitable, all the scandal this would cause, as if I cared about scandal more than my children's happiness. Society will talk. Josephine said quietly. A duke marrying a governess. It's unprecedented. Society can go hang. His vehemence surprised her. I've spent 3 years caring what society thought, letting grief and propriety dictate my choices. Where did it get me? 2 miserable children and a house that felt like a mausoleum. You brought life back to Ashford Manor, Josephine. You brought life back to me. They arrived at the manor as the sun was breaking through the morning clouds, painting the grey stone golden. Josephine's heart hammered as Frederick helped her from the carriage. The servants who greeted them tried to hide their surprise, but she saw the speculation in their eyes, the whispers already beginning. Mrs. Blackwood appeared in the doorway, her severe expression softening when she saw Josephine. Miss Hartley, welcome home. Home. The word settled into Josephine's chest like a benediction. Where are the children? Frederick asked. In the nursery, Your Grace. Miss Ashworth left yesterday in quite a state, and they've been difficult since. They climbed the stairs together, Frederick's hand at the small of Josephine's back, a gesture of support and possession that made her pulse quicken. At the nursery door, he paused. Would you like me to come in with you? No, Josephine said softly. Let me go to them first. She opened the door to find the nursery in disarray. Books scattered across the floor, chairs overturned, the remnants of what looked like a considerable tantrum. Charlotte sat on the window seat, her face pressed against the glass, while Edmund huddled in the corner with his knees drawn up to his chest. I told you, Charlotte was saying, her voice thick with tears. Papa won't bring her back. He never listens to what we want. He promised, Edmund whispered. He promised he'd try. Children, Josephine said quietly. 2 heads whipped around. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Charlotte screamed, a sound of pure joy, and launched herself across the room. Edmund was right behind her, and suddenly Josephine was on her knees with both children in her arms, all 3 of them crying and laughing at once. You came back, Charlotte sobbed into her shoulder. You came back, you came back, you came back. I told you Papa would fix it, Edmund said fiercely, his thin arms wrapped around her waist. I told you he wasn't a complete nodcock. Edmund! Josephine tried to sound stern, but she was laughing too hard. You mustn't call your father names, even when they're accurate. Frederick's voice came from the doorway, warm with amusement. The children released Josephine and ran to their father, who caught them both, his eyes bright with unshed tears. I kept my promise, he said. Miss Josephine is home, and if she'll have us, she's going to stay forever. Are you getting married? Charlotte demanded, because that's the only way to make sure she can't leave again. Yes, Frederick said, looking over their heads to meet Josephine's eyes. We're getting married. The children's celebration was so loud that servants came running, thinking someone was hurt. Instead, they found the Duke and his children and the former governess all tangled together in an embrace, laughing and crying in equal measure. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of preparation and adjustment. The announcement of the engagement caused exactly the scandal Josephine had predicted. Society matrons clutched their pearls, gossip columns had a field day, and several of Frederick's more conservative relatives sent strongly worded letters expressing their disapproval. Frederick read each letter aloud at breakfast, then tossed them into the fire with theatrical flourish, much to the children's delight. Your cousin Reginald says I'm debasing the family name, he announced one morning. Cousin Reginald has 3 mistresses and a gambling problem, Charlotte said primly, making Josephine choke on her tea. I heard the servants talking. Where on earth did you learn such things? Josephine demanded. I'm very observant, Charlotte said with dignity, and the servants like me better now that you're back. They tell me things. But not all reactions were negative. Aunt Marguerite arrived for an extended visit, declaring herself delighted by this turn of events. Dr. Whitmore sent a gracious note wishing them happiness, along with a book on educational theory for Josephine. Mrs. Chen wrote, offering to help establish a school on the Ashford estate for the tenants' children. You see, Frederick said, reading the letter over Josephine's shoulder, you're already changing things for the better. Imagine what you'll accomplish as a duchess." The word still felt foreign, impossible, but slowly, Josephine began to believe it might be real. The private confrontation she'd been dreading came one afternoon when she encountered Miss Ashworth in the village. The woman was visiting her mother's family, and the meeting was unavoidable. "Miss Hartley," Cordelia said, her voice cold as January frost. "Or should I say, Your Grace-to-be?" "Miss Ashworth." Josephine kept her voice level, refusing to be baited. "I hope you found a new position. I've had several offers, actually. Families who value proper breeding and education over sentimentality." Her smile was sharp. "But I wanted to tell you something before I leave this godforsaken county. You may have won the Duke, but you'll never truly belong in his world. You'll always be the governess who got lucky, the charity case he elevated out of guilt. Society will never let you forget it." For a moment, the old insecurities rose up. All the doubts about her worthiness, her place, her right to the happiness she'd found. Then she thought of Charlotte's laughter, Edmund's trust, Frederick's love freely given. "You're right," Josephine said calmly. "I'll never be what you are. Someone who values titles over people, breeding over kindness, propriety over love. And I thank God for it every day." She stepped closer, her voice dropping. "You had everything, beauty, connections, education, but you couldn't make two grieving children smile. You couldn't help a broken man remember how to live. All your advantages, and you failed at the only thing that mattered. So yes, I'm the governess who got lucky, but you're the woman who had every opportunity and squandered it through cruelty and pride. I know which I'd rather be." She walked away without waiting for a response, her head high, her heart steady. The wedding was planned for late May, a small ceremony in the manor's chapel, followed by a garden reception. Josephine had insisted on simplicity, but Frederick and the children had other ideas. Charlotte appointed herself chief wedding planner, filling notebooks with elaborate sketches of flower arrangements and cake designs. Edmund took charge of the music, practicing piano pieces with fierce determination. "They're trying to give you the wedding they think you deserve," Frederick explained one evening as they walked through the gardens, properly chaperoned by Aunt Marguerite at a discreet distance. "I don't need elaborate," Josephine said. "I just need you. And them." "I know." He stopped walking, turning to face her. "But let them do this. They're so happy, Josephine. For the first time since Eleanor died, they're planning for the future instead of mourning the past. Let them celebrate." She looked up at him, this man who had seemed so cold and distant when she first arrived, now revealed as tender and thoughtful beneath his grief. "Do you think about her? Your first wife?" "Every day," he said honestly, "but not with the same pain. You haven't replaced her, Josephine. You've helped us all remember that love doesn't end when someone dies. It transforms, makes room for new love alongside the old. Eleanor would have liked you, I think. She would have been grateful that you loved our children when I was too broken to do it properly." "You always loved them," Josephine said firmly. "You just forgot how to show it." "And you reminded me." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "You reminded all of us how to be a family again." The night before the wedding, Josephine stood in what would soon be her bedroom, the Duchess's chambers, connected to Frederick's by a door that had been locked since Eleanor's death. Aunt Marguerite had helped her prepare, and now she stood before the mirror in her nightgown, trying to recognize the woman looking back at her. A soft knock came at the connecting door. "May I come in?" Frederick's voice, tentative. "Yes." He entered, still fully dressed, his expression serious. "I wanted to give you something before tomorrow, something that belonged to Eleanor." Josephine's breath caught as he opened a velvet box, revealing a delicate necklace of pearls and sapphires. "Frederick, I can't." "She would want you to have it. I asked the children, and they agreed." He moved behind her, fastening the necklace around her throat. "You're not erasing her memory, Josephine. You're honoring it by loving us so well." She met his eyes in the mirror, seeing the truth of his words reflected there. "I'll try to be worthy of this. Of all of it." "You already are." He pressed a kiss to her temple, then stepped back. "Sleep well, my love. Tomorrow we begin again." Her days. After he left, Josephine touched the necklace at her throat, feeling the weight of history and hope combined. Tomorrow she would become a duchess, but more importantly, she would become a wife, a mother, a woman who had chosen her own destiny, instead of accepting the limitations others tried to impose. The golden cage had transformed into something else entirely, not a prison, but a home, and she was walking into it with her eyes wide open and her heart full of joy. 8 months had passed since Josephine Hartley became the Duchess of Ashford, and the transformation of the manor was nothing short of miraculous. The house that had once felt like a mausoleum now rang with laughter and life. Servants smiled as they went about their duties, windows stood open to let in light and air, and the gardens, once meticulously maintained but soulless, had been redesigned to include a children's play area and a reading arbor where Josephine often took her lessons outdoors. It was a crisp October morning when Josephine stood in the newly established schoolroom, watching as a dozen tenant children bent over their slates, practicing their letters. The school had been her first major project as Duchess, a small building on the estate grounds where children of the workers could receive education regardless of their family's ability to pay. "Excellent work, Thomas," she said, pausing beside a boy of 7 whose tongue poked out in concentration as he formed his letters. "Your penmanship is improving remarkably." Mrs. Chen, who had agreed to help establish the curriculum, stood at the front of the room, leading the older children through a mathematics lesson. She caught Josephine's eye and smiled, a look of shared satisfaction passing between them. Charlotte and Edmund attended lessons alongside the tenant children 3 days a week, a decision that had scandalized some of the neighboring families, but which Frederick had supported wholeheartedly. "They need to understand the world, beyond their privilege," he'd said, "and what better teacher than their mother?" Mother. The word still filled Josephine with wonder. The children had begun calling her Mama within weeks of the wedding, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence. She hadn't tried to replace Eleanor, her portrait still hung in the gallery, and they spoke of her often, but she had carved out her own place in their hearts. After lessons concluded, Josephine walked back to the manor with Charlotte and Edmund flanking her, both chattering about their day. The autumn sun painted everything gold, and Josephine felt a contentment so profound it was almost painful. "Mamma, look!" Edmund pointed to where Frederick was riding up the drive, returning from his morning inspection of the estate. He'd changed in the past months, too. The shadows had lifted from his eyes, and he smiled readily now, especially when he looked at his family. He dismounted as they approached, and Charlotte launched herself at him with her usual exuberance. "Papa! Mamma says if we finish our French lessons early this week, we can put on a play for Aunt Marguerite when she visits." "A play?" Frederick's eyes met Josephine's over their daughter's head, warm with affection. "Your mother is full of excellent ideas." "Ah, she's full of excellent everything," Edmund said seriously, making them all laugh. That evening, after the children were in bed, Josephine and Frederick sat in the library, their favorite room, where they'd spent countless hours talking, reading, simply being together. A fire crackled in the grate, and Josephine was curled in a chair with a book, while Frederick reviewed estate correspondence. "There's a letter here from Lady Pemberton," he said, amusement colouring his voice. "She wants to know if you'd speak at her next charity event about establishing schools for working-class children. Apparently, word of our little school has spread, and several other estates are considering similar projects." "Me? Speak publicly?" Josephine set down her book, anxiety fluttering in her chest. "You're a duchess now, darling. People listen when you speak." He crossed to her chair, kneeling beside it so they were eye level. "You've already changed so much, this estate, our family, the lives of those children in your school. Why not share what you've learned with others who might do the same? Because 8 months ago, I was a dismissed governess with no prospects. Sometimes I still can't believe this is real." "Believe it." He took her hand, pressing it to his chest where she could feel his heartbeat. "You've earned every bit of this, Josephine. Not through luck or charity, but through your own merit, your own goodness. You saved us. Let us help you save others." She looked into his eyes, this man who had seemed so cold and unreachable when they first met, and saw nothing but love and pride. "All right," she whispered. "I'll do it." His smile was radiant. "That's my brave Duchess." The invitation to speak came with another piece of news. Miss Cordelia Ashworth had accepted a position as governess to a wealthy merchant family in Liverpool. According to Lady Pemberton's letter, the position had come with a substantial salary but little prestige, and Cordelia had taken it only after several aristocratic families had declined to employ her following the scandal of her dismissal from Ashford Manor. "Do you feel vindicated?" Frederick asked, watching Josephine's face as she read. "No," she said slowly. "I feel sad for her. She had so many advantages, but she never learned that connection matters more than correctness. I hope she finds happiness eventually. You're far more generous than she deserves." He pulled her from her chair into his arms. "But that's one of the many reasons I love you." The speech at Lady Pemberton's event was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Josephine stood before 200 members of London society, many of whom had witnessed her humiliation at the previous gala, and spoke about education as a tool for social mobility, about the responsibility of privilege, about seeing children as individuals rather than vessels for class expectations. She saw some faces harden with disapproval, but others, more than she'd expected, leaned forward with interest. When she finished, the applause was genuine, and several women approached her afterward with questions about implementing similar programs on their own estates. "You were magnificent," Frederick murmured as they left the event. "Did you see Lord Ashworth's face? He looked like he'd swallowed a lemon." "Frederick," Josephine chided, but she was smiling, "we mustn't gloat." "Why not? His daughter tried to destroy you, and instead you've become one of the most talked-about women in society. I think a little gloating is warranted." They returned to Ashford Manor to find Aunt Marguerite had arrived early for her visit, and the children were staging an impromptu performance in the drawing-room. Charlotte had draped herself in curtains fashioned into a gown, while Edmund narrated a story about a brave governess who saved a kingdom from a dragon. "The dragon was very mean," Edmund intoned seriously. "He tried to make everyone follow stupid rules and speak perfect French. But the governess was smarter and kinder, so she won." "I wonder where they got that idea," Frederick whispered in Josephine's ear, making her laugh. Later, after the children were finally asleep and Aunt Marguerite had retired, Josephine stood at the window of her bedroom, looking out over the moonlit gardens. She heard the connecting door open and felt Frederick's arms come around her waist. "Happy?" he asked softly. "Impossibly so." She leaned back against him. "Sometimes I think about that day I arrived here, so nervous, so uncertain of my place. I never imagined that you'd become the heart of this family." "I did. From the moment I saw you with the children during Edmund's fever, I knew you were extraordinary. I was just too much of a coward to admit it." "You weren't a coward. You were grieving. I was both." He turned her in his arms so she faced him. "But you taught me that grief doesn't have to be the end of the story. That love can grow even in the darkest soil, that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as governesses with worn carpet-bags and too observant eyes." She reached up to touch his face, this man who had given her everything she'd never dared to dream of. "The children asked me today if we might have a brother or sister for them someday." His eyes widened. "And what did you tell them?" "I told them that such things are in God's hands, but that I hoped so too." She smiled at his expression. "Is that all right?" Instead of answering, he kissed her, tender and deep and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "More than all right," he whispered. "Everything about you is more than all right, Josephine. You're the miracle I didn't know I needed." In the months that followed, Josephine's school expanded to include evening classes for adults who wanted to learn to read. 3 neighbouring estates established similar programs, citing the Duchess of Ashford's example. Josephine published an essay on educational reform that was widely circulated among progressive circles, and through it all she remained grounded in what mattered most, her family. Charlotte grew into a confident, compassionate girl who announced her intention to become a teacher, like her mother. Edmund's gift for mathematics led to correspondence with professors at Cambridge, who were astonished by the young lord's abilities. And Frederick, who had once been a ghost in his own home, became a devoted husband and father, active in his children's lives and supportive of his wife's work. One spring morning, exactly a year after their wedding, Josephine stood in the garden with Frederick, watching the children play. Her hand rested on the slight swell of her belly, a secret they'd shared with no one yet, wanting to savour it privately a little longer. "Do you ever regret it?" Frederick asked. "Giving up the quiet life you might have had, the work in Manchester with Dr. Whitmore?" "Never." She turned to look at him, this man who had become her partner in every sense. "That would have been a good life. But this is everything. You, the children, the work we're doing here, it's more than I ever imagined possible. Even with all the scandal, the gossip, the relatives who still won't speak to us, especially with all that." She smiled. "It means we chose each other, despite the obstacles, that our love was strong enough to weather society's disapproval. That's worth more than any amount of easy acceptance." He pulled her close, mindful of the precious cargo she carried. "I love you, Josephine Ashford. My Duchess, my wife, my salvation. And I love you," she whispered back, "my Duke, my husband, my home." In the distance, Charlotte's laughter rang out as Edmund chased her through the flower beds, both children gloriously, messily happy. The manor stood behind them, no longer a monument to grief, but a testament to resilience, to second chances, to the transformative power of love. Josephine had arrived at Ashford Manor as a governess, with nothing but a carpet-bag and hope. She had been dismissed, humiliated, broken, but she had also been brave enough to accept a second chance, wise enough to recognize true love when it was offered, and strong enough to claim the life she deserved. She had bloomed where she was planted, and in doing so had helped an entire family, an entire community bloom alongside her. The golden cage had become a garden, and she was finally truly home. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to share more stories with you soon.